How to protect the knees and lotus and related postures.
Lotus pose padmasana
Is a supreme position for meditation, and lotus variations of other asanas can be profound.
However, forcing the legs into lotus is one of the most dangerous things you can do in yoga. Each year, many yogi seriously enter their knees this way. Often the culprit is not the student, but an over-enthusiastic teacher physically pushing a student into the pose. Fortunately, there are techniques that make padmasana much safer to learn. Even if you don't teach full lotus, you can use the same techniques to protect students in related postures, such as
Padmasana,
half-bound half-lotus,
forward bend, Baddha Konasana, bound angle pose,
and Janusasana, head-to-knee pose. These poses can do wonders for the hip joints and the muscles around them. Unfortunately, many students feel a painful, pinching sensation in the inner knee in all of them.
To understand why and how to prevent it, consider the underlying anatomy.
The problem starts at the hip joint, where lotus and its relatives
require an astounding degree of mobility.
When you move from a neutral, seated posture, such as Dandasana staff pose,
to Baddha Konasana, the ball-shaped head of the thigh bone must rotate outward in the hip socket about 100 degrees, bending the knee and placing the foot in preparation
for Janus or Susana
requires somewhat less external rotation. But as a student bends forward in the pose,
the tilt of the pelvis relative to the femur brings the total rotation to about 115 degrees. Padmasana requires the same amount of external rotation,
115 degrees,
just sitting upright, and the angle of rotation is somewhat different, making it more challenging for many students when we combine the Padmasana action with a forward bend,
as we do in Uttabodha Padmasana.
The total external rotation
required at the hip joint jumps to about 145 degrees. To put this in perspective, imagine that if you could turn your thighs out 145 degrees
while standing,
your kneecaps and feet would end up pointing behind you.
If a student can achieve all of this outward rotation
at the hip and lotus, they can then safely lift the foot up
and across onto the opposite thigh without bending the knee sideways. See Figure 1.
Some people with naturally mobile hips can do this easily,
but for most people, the thigh bone stops rotating partway into the pose. This limitation may be due to tight muscles or tight ligaments, or in some cases, to bone-to-bone limitations deep in the hip. When the femur stops rotating,
the only way to get the foot up higher
is to bend the knee sideways.
Knees are not designed to do this. They are only designed to flex and extend. If an overzealous student continues to pull the foot up after his thigh stops externally rotating, or if the student or teacher forces the knee downward, the thigh bone and shin bone will act like long levers that apply great force to the knee. Like a pair of long-handled bolt cutters, they will pinch the inner cartilage of the knee between the inner ends of the femur and tibia. In anatomical terms, the medial meniscus will be squeezed between the medial femoral condyle and the medial tibial condyle. In layman's terms, the inner ends of the thigh and shin will squeeze the inner cartilage of the knee.
With even moderate force,
this action can seriously damage the meniscus. Such injuries can be very painful,
debilitating, and slow to heal.
How to approach Padmasana and Janusasana to avoid knee injuries. Poses like Baddha Konasana
and Janusasana
can cause similar pinching.
In these postures, we do not usually pull up on the foot, so the problem comes mainly
from the lack of outward rotation of the thigh relative to the pelvis. Let's first look at Baddha Konasana.
Remember to stay upright and stable. While placing the feet in Baddha Konasana, the heads of the femurs will turn
strongly outward, about 100 degrees,
in the hip sockets.
Because this requires so much flexibility of the entire hip region, many students instead allow the top rim of the pelvis to tilt backward
while placing the feet in Baddha Konasana.
They move the thighs and pelvis as a single unit.
This requires little rotation
of the heads of the femurs
in the hip sockets,
and it demands little flexibility. It also defeats the aim of mobilizing the hip joints
and causes the entire spine to slump.
As a teacher, you may find yourself instructing the slumping student to tilt the top rim of the pelvis forward in order to bring them upright. If their hips are loose enough,
This instruction won't create a problem,
the pelvis will tilt forward, the thighs will remain externally rotated,
and the spine will come upright. But if the hips are too tight,
the femurs and pelvis will roll forward as a single unit,
while the thigh bones rotate forward,
the shins will not, resulting in the aforementioned pinching in the inner knees.
this explains why some students do not feel any knee pain in padmasana
Until they attempt to tilt the pelvis
completely upright.
Some students complain of knee pain only when they bend forward in poses that require external rotation. That's because a forward bend, like Jainash or Susanna, demands even more external rotation.
At the hip joint, again in the tight student,
The pelvis and femur
roll forward,
as a single unit,
pinching the inner knee.
of course in either Padmasana or Jonas or Susanna. Pushing the knees downward makes the problem worse.
Because tight muscles,
Make the femur rotate forward
as it is pressed,
avoid knee injuries.
in lotus pose.
Padmasana now.
Back to lotus pose.
Forcing the knees into Padmasana by lifting up on the ankles can also enter the outside of the knee. When a student lifts
The shin bone,
without adequately rotating the thigh,
it not only
closes the inner knee,
it opens the outer knee,
overstretching the lateral collateral ligament.
If a student then forcibly turns the feet so the soles point upward, which people often do, to get the feet higher up on the thighs, they can worsen the strain.
This action of turning the soles actually pulls the ankle bone away from the knee, creating a chain reaction all the way up to the lateral collateral ligament.
What's the solution? First, use common sense. Never force a student into lotus
Or related poses.
and discourage students from forcing themselves. Teach students not to push into pain, especially knee pain.
Do not adjust the
Pose by pulling on the foot or ankle.
nor by pushing down on the knee.
Instead, either teacher or student should apply firm,
Outward rotating action to the thigh,
turning the femur around its long axis,
using the hands or a strap dot if your student already has any pain but can do basic
standing poses comfortably. Teach these poses first.
with careful alignment.
This can bring her a long way toward recovery.
When you reintroduce problem,
Seated poses such as Badak Khan,
Asuna and Janasa Susanna
use the hands or a strap to apply the same outward rotating action described.
above for Lotus. For students who are ready to learn Lotus,
Introduce it gradually, working from
poses that require less external rotation,
at the hip, such as sitting in Uttabandha
Padmasana,
without bending forward, to those that require more, such as full Padmasana.
wait until last to introduce poses that require the most external rotation, forward bending.
Variations of full Padmasana.
As students are learning these poses, teach them to rotate their thighs outward either with a hands-on adjustment
Or self-adjustment.
Instruct them to monitor and avoid pinching sensations in the inner knees.
Encourage your students to go slowly.
Be patient and persist,
In time, they may be able to sit comfortably.
and meditate deeply in Padmasana. If not, remind them that true meditation lies
Not in some specific posture, but in the spirit of their practice. Help them find a posture that suits them
then guide them to settle in
and experience the stillness that is yoga.